My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Hi there. Welcome to Safety Labs. Authors such as Decker, Edmondson, Reason, Holnagel, and Conklin have inspired safety professionals all over the world with their ideas about human error and its place in larger systems. And yet there is some critique of their work. Some of it questions their ideas, but a common refrain is that the academic style of their writing is inaccessible to many people and therefore has less impact than it might otherwise have. Our guest has set out in part to remedy that with the book that we'll discuss today. With over 30 years of field and academic experience across 3 continents, Dr. Simon Goncharenko leads expert services at Veriforce. He teaches safety policy and ethics at Liberty University and is reshaping safety culture worldwide. He's a respected voice in operational excellence and human factors who has worked with global giants like Google, Meta, and BHP. Simon is an active public speaker and author of 6 books, including the one we'll discuss today, entitled Save Lives: Pushing Boundaries in Human Factors. He developed and trains organizations in the world's first human factors program for mission-critical facilities, entitled Save Lives: Global Human and Organizational Factors. Simon joins us from Houston, Texas. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So let's start with the style of writing. Why was it important for you to choose a different style than is commonly used by the authors that I mentioned in the introduction?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question. And in fact, it's interesting because at the very beginning of the book, given the wide range of resources already in this field, I actually have to, or at least I felt like at the very beginning of my book, that I've had to answer a very simple question: why this resource? Why now? And so I actually go through, I think, at least 5 or 6 different things that I have listed as to what makes this resource stand out from the rest and why it's different. One of the differences that you had brought up is actually the style. As an academic myself, I had previously published and written resources that were heavily footnoted, and with a lot of research, a lot of evidence, where you had to kind of document every single step and every claim that you make. And there's room and there's place for those types of resources. However, where the idea for this book actually originated, believe it or not, is, and this will, I think, answer the question. I was doing a podcast much like this one, but what was different about that podcast was it was called Two Safety Dudes or something like that. It was very laid back, right? And I kid you not, these guys were 2 safety professionals in construction industry. And we recorded this podcast. Both of them were in their respective trucks at a parking lot of their employer during their lunch break. And so that's kind of how we recorded the podcast. And it got my wheels going as we were having a conversation, a very engaging, very fun conversation. And one of them is we were kind of talking about the day-to-day struggles, concerns, issues, and even in a lingo that they're used to, right? And one of them said, dude, if you ever have a book on all these things that we're talking about, I would love to buy it. And it made me realize, it clicked in my mind that Holnagel, Reason, Conklin, Decker, awesome guys. I mean, and I can continue, Proctor, Zant, continue adding names to that list. But their style is not something that these 2 safety dudes in the construction industry are ever going to pick up and read. And so that's where I think my book comes in, is I purposed from the very beginning to write it in an easy to read, almost like this 8th grade level vocabulary with minimal citations. It was very hard for an academic to have no footnotes of the entire book, but that was one of the purposes I've made. I often direct my audiences to either the bibliography on the back end of the book or to common search engines of their choice, where they can easily given them right prompts for the searchers where they can easily locate the information. So everything that I write is documentable. None of it is made up or fictitious or fake news or anything like that. But all of it is purposefully made in a very easy to read format because I'm trying to reach the segment of population that those other resources probably will not be able to reach.
Here's a question I've tried to wrap my head around before, and I think our audience is likely a lot more familiar with human factors than I am. But can you explain to me what is human factors as a discipline and maybe give me like a brief history of how it developed?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a great question, actually. And it's interesting because just recently on LinkedIn, I had actually entertained the idea, and it was funny because it appeared that that particular engagement actually produced a lot of interaction. People really kind of enjoyed it, and the idea there is really that human factors is a discipline. I mean, we can kind of go historically way back, right, into like, let's say, late 19th, early 20th century when factory owners in the UK would put residential complexes or residences for the factory workers close to the factory because they recognized that it makes it easier for their workers to access work and it would build a sense of community. And they saw that it actually had an increase in productivity. So there were some elements, without like formally recognizing that that's what they were doing, they were recognizing some tendencies and elements of human factors there. So we saw some of those tendencies kind of in history early on. But formally, as a discipline, human factors began developing after World War II, where there were some findings that originated with some bombers that B-2 bombers that were not successfully returning from missions, and they were trying to look into what was it that was contributing to some insane amount of crashes and those kinds of things. And at one point, one of the ideas that was kind of pushed around was, well, maybe we finally designed a piece of equipment that's just too complicated for us to operate. Well, of course, that wasn't it. What it was number one, checklists weren't utilized. I mean, you'd be shocked. When you and I go into a commercial airplane to fly today, it is very normal, and we expect to see or hear pilot and co-pilot go through the checklist, pre-flight checklist. That's a normal thing. Well, it wasn't done then. And then on top of that, they also discovered some of the controls, for whether it's landing gear or whatever, were situated so close to one another, and they looked so much like one another to where under the duress of whether it's combat or in the stress of a battle or whatever, the pilots would reach for the control and they would inadvertently push on the wrong control or pull the wrong lever or whatever. And so that's kind of how it came about. And so as a science, and it has a development kind of goes back to a lot of European resources, right? And as a science, it looks at the human-machine interaction. It looks at the way that systems interface. It has ties to resilient thinking. It has ties to high-performing organizations. And it is out of that science that the more philosophical approach of HOP, or human organizational performance, kind of also originated from, or in a sense kind of stemmed from that. Didn't fully originate, but there's a lot of parallels there. So that's what human factors is. It goes back to, I guess, World War II European context, and there are degrees that you can actually get, university degrees in human factors, whether it's bachelor's, master's, PhD. And so there's a Society of Human Factors that has an annual convention, publications, and so on and so forth. So it's a well-developed or well-oiled machine that has, and some of the more high-hazard industries in the U.S. have actually had, I guess, more interaction with the subject of human factors than others. So like oil and gas maybe hasn't as much, but energy, for example, has. In fact, the Department of Energy has developed a human factors handbook a few decades ago. And even in the U.S. here, our military personnel, whether it's U.S. Air Force or U.S. Navy, has incorporated over the last couple of decades various human factors principles and trainings. And of course, we all know that the aviation industry, in a lot of places around the world, there are regulatory requirements for an annual human factors training and refreshers because of obviously the benefit that they have derived from that. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how
It does. Yeah. It sounds like there's a lot of overlap and interaction with things like engineering and certainly safety and ergonomics and a whole bunch of different things. So I want to move on to talk a little bit about other theories in safety. One of them is behavior-based safety. So one of your critiques was that in safety, traditionally, when you talk about focusing on behavior, that meant focusing on frontline behavior exclusively. So it's based on the unspoken assumption that only the frontline workers perform or can perform unsafe acts. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit and any other critiques or discussion you have about behavior-based safety.
Absolutely. And just to be very clear from the start, I think one of the things as an individual, I kind of consider myself a lifelong student, right? I never consider myself to have arrived somewhere to have finally, realized something, and I have no place to improve and no place to learn. And even since writing and publishing my book, I think what I'm realizing too, that goes back to the core of what we've already discussed, goes back to the core of even the reason for my book is I'm a practitioner at heart. And so what that means is that I am not so married to the latest and greatest or to any single philosophy or way of doing things. And that's the reason my book is actually entitled what it is because at the end of the day, what motivates me and what moves me and what keeps me going in this field is the desire to save lives, to do everything we can. And so I say that here because I think there are some different challenges and some issues with behavior-based safety, but there are some good things and there's some good tools that behavior-based safety brought to the table. And so my criticism is not to say, let's leave aside and let's leave behind every single thing related to behavior-based safety and let's fully adopt human factors or human organizational performance and so on and so forth. To the extent that maybe like Decker or even Conklin sometimes push it. Decker goes as far as to refer himself and push for, I think he talks about the safety anarchist or something like that. I think that goes a little bit to the extreme. I think that almost goes into the whole, like almost this, I grew up in the former Soviet Union. And so I grew up with communism being kind of propagated and preached and so on and so forth. And so to me, it almost sounds like a little bit of a safety communism ideas kind of coming to the fore. My approach and my philosophy on that is let's get the best of every philosophy and every system that's out there. Let's leverage the best possible tools that we can so that by all means, by every means possible, we can save as many lives as we can. That's kind of overall my philosophy. So having said that, I will now kind of go to answering your question. I think there are definitely some good things. The observations, for example, some of the accountability areas of behavior-based safety, I think are good. But I think we have over the years had some wrong methodologies and we have misapplied a lot of the good parts in behavior-based safety. So for example, the example that you used, and I have seen that so many times in practice in across various industries where organizations that fully buy into behavior-based safety tend to apply its tenets to just what Conklin would call the sharp end, or what Decker would call the sharp end of the pencil, right? Just the frontline personnel. And so it creates this dilemma and it creates this dichotomy where safety is done to you. It's not done with you. And therefore, you kind of have this two-tier justice system, if you will, in an organizational setting where, the leadership never participates in any safety briefings and is there for safety is kind of the safety person's job and the safety person's responsibility. and they're responsible for making people safe, and everyone else is just there to make money, right? And that's just a totally different way of doing things. So that's one of my biggest critiques of behavior-based safety, is that it is subject to misapplication. It has been misapplied quite a bit. And some of its principles, I think, are too overly simplistic. And I think I mentioned that in my book. You can move a single cell protozoa, a single cell amoeba, by sugar, or to attract it, to reward it, or by some pain associated type signals that will discourage it or move it away. But humans are multi-billion cell organism that also has things like moods and things like, I don't feel like doing it. And so behavior-based safety sometimes is overly simplistic, thinking that using just rewards or just punishment, you can actually fully control and motivate workforce. I say it takes more. It takes more than that. A single cell amoeba does not wake up one day and just says, "I don't feel like doing something." That's one other issue, I think, with behavior-based safety. So, all in all, it has some good parts, and I think those organizations that are utilizing it should continue to utilize it. But they also need to step back and look at a more systemic way of doing things and reevaluate where they have misapplied behavior-based safety to their own detriment.
Yeah, it made sense when it came in. It, as I understand it, did revolutionize the way we look at things. So in that context, right now, in our moment in safety history, you say that it's important to focus on SIFs, serious incidents and fatalities. So why is that focus important right now?
That's also a really good question. And I guess I'm starting a trend here. As with every other question that you've asked, I'm going to qualify my answer for this question as well.
Totally fine.
Before I go
We're all about
it.
context.
Exactly. And an individual I know and respect in safety context, or in safety context, sometimes answers every question with the words, or begins the answer to every question with the words, "It depends." And I think it really does depend on a lot of different things, right? So here, first of all, I want to qualify my answer by saying that I don't believe that replacing one lagging indicator, total recordable incident rate, with another lagging indicator, serious injuries and fatalities, is the only answer out there. Because at the end of the day, both are lagging indicators. And I think we need to keep that in mind, and we need to remember that in the back of our minds. So having qualified that and having said that, I will say that multiple studies are now showing us that in the last 30 to 40 years, we have successfully brought our total recordable incident rate down quite a bit. I mean, I've seen different statistics from 68% over the last 40 years to 84% over the last 20 years. Again, depending on where you look at the stats, the numbers are pretty staggering and they're pretty impressive. We've done a good job. Now, let's unpack the numbers a little bit, because does that mean that we have made our workplaces 84% more safe? See, that's a different question, and it will produce a different answer. Because when I say that we've brought TRIR numbers down, that's part of that answer, is we have made our workplaces somewhat safer, but we have also figured out how to keep an incident from being recordable, whether it is by playing a little bit loosely with recordability, whether it is by having special arrangements with our local occupational clinics, whether it is by employing on-site, medics and on-site nurses and so on and so forth. We have gone and we have used every means possible to bring that number down. So it doesn't mean, if we brought TRIR down, let's say by 68% in the last 40 years, it doesn't mean that our workplaces are 68% more safe in the last 40 years. So that, just to be clear, that's there, right? That's a consideration there. And so in connection with that, or also along with those numbers, we're also seeing a different trend continue. And that is when we are focusing on kind of this overall TRIR and we're focusing on overall recordability, what we have allowed or what has happened, and that's the law of unintended consequences, right? The law of unintended consequences says you're focusing sometimes on one thing and without intending it, you're producing something totally different on the other side. And that's kind of what we've done here is by virtue of that law, we have watched in the last 20 years the trend on serious injuries and fatalities not only not go down at the same rate as our TRIR trend, but we have seen that trend actually start out by kind of stubbornly refusing to go down and then starting to come up. And so you can have organizations out there that have just incredible TRIR numbers. I mean, we're talking about 0 point, you fill in the blank. They say, I don't know who they are, but the consensus is that 0.5 or below is world-class safety. Okay, great. But here's what they are not asking is we're seeing those organizations with world-class safety, with that insane TRIR, also experience multiple fatalities on an annual basis. And the nature or the number of their workforce is large enough to where that doesn't affect their overall, TRIR, because as you know, that is divided by the total work hours. And so they're able to hide that. But how do you put a price on human life? And so that's the reason, right, that we are looking at it and we're saying, okay, we've successfully brought TRIR numbers down, but we're realizing that those things that allow us to bring those numbers down are not causing an equal decline in serious injuries and fatalities. And so now we're saying it's time for us to, some folks are basically saying, hey, let's abandon this or let's leave behind this tyranny of TRIR and let's focus on these significant things that actually maim or injure. And there are lots of different definitions. That was one of the first things that kind of started out with, how do you define a SIF? And folks came up with different definitions. OSHA, of course, has a definition. CSRA folks out of Colorado came out with a life definition. If it's life-altering, life-ending, life impacting, then that's a SIF. And then you have some, ASTMs coming out, whether through NSC and some other organizations, ASSP has some ANSI standards. And so you have some NSC, for example, has ASTM 2920 that they have just updated. The 2025 edition of it is, I think, working through its way of approval. And they have 3 other standards that they're also putting out there. These are consensus standards that could bring folks on the same page so that we can define things the same way, so that we could protect our employees the same way, and so on and so forth. So that's really what it's all about. It's about continuing that mission of bringing workers home safe. It's just focusing on things that actually hurt us or maim us, as opposed to things that twist our ankles or things that we've gotten quite good at. I wouldn't say hiding, but preventing from being recordable.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're advocating for, sounds to me like, is some curiosity. So not taking the numbers, first of all, understanding that lagging indicators have inherent problems. Also understanding that numbers are not, because there are ways around them, numbers are not necessarily, like, looking at overall trends is probably more important than looking at specific numbers. But so not to hyper-focus on the measure, but maybe get curious about the trend, I would say. Does that sound right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you can't, when you look at the numbers, for example, in my experience, I find, just like you said, you have to look at more than one number, right? So you need to look at not just TRIR, but for example, here in the US, you have EMR, experience modification rate. That's an insurance rate, right? But a lot of times when your EMR is high, and EMR is a 3-year rate, so it's not an annual rate. That's another thing with TRIR that's interesting. Folks, one of the other issues with TRIR, aside from everything that we've mentioned, is there have been numerous studies that have also revealed couple of things. First of all, statistical validity. I mean, you need to have some serious data sets to even be able to have any kind of statistical validity. And when I say serious, I mean something to the effect of billion plus work hours. Only when you get to that point, that's when you start getting you start approximating some degree of statistical validity with total recordable incident rate. I'm going to tell you this. In my experience, most of our organizations are not dealing with billion plus work hour type of data sets, right? And so that means we're far away from statistical validity when it comes to total recordable incident rate. The thing that kind of sometimes is my pet peeve is not only when we just track the annual TRIR, which again does not have nearly enough work hours to provide statistical validity. But the thing that I cannot stand is when we start looking at like monthly or quarterly TRIR, which takes it so much further down into this area of statistical invalidity and just numbers for the sake of numbers, zero story there, right? But the other thing that's interesting too, that's coming out about TRIR, and that's kind of a little bit aside. I know from what you're asking, but the number is also not, TRIR is also not telling us whether we're good or lucky. Like that number doesn't tell us whether that organization is actually really effective in implementing the right controls or whether they just lucked out, you know? And so there's zero predictive validity. And that I guess goes back to all the lagging indicators. They don't tell you what's going to happen. They told you what did happen, right? And so yeah, exactly. So absolutely. That's why I say, sometimes I like to kind of compare TRIR, which is an annual number, with EMR, which is a 3-year number, right? And kind of see if there's any discrepancy there that will reveal, if one number is being tinkered with a little bit more than the other, right? And then, look at, like we mentioned, look at the fatality rates, look at significant injury rates. And the good news about this awesome age in which we live is that there is so much research out there. There literally, I can probably start naming half a dozen of different other more proactive and leading type indicators, right? That have been proposed and that have been suggested, that the adaptation of which will allow us to have in conjunction with TRIR or whatever other numbers you're looking at, then to your point, you can see a more full picture. When you're looking at just one thing, you have a very small idea of what actually the organization is all about.
So actually, that touches on something I wanted to ask. In several parts of the book, like in different contexts, you talk about the concept of going broader. So would that be an example of what you mean by this, and why is that a useful practice?
No, that's definitely one of the examples. Why it's a useful practice, because like we just talked, if you want to know the actual picture of where your organization is, then you need to ask more questions than just what your TRIR is. If you want to know where your organization is going, you need to go outside of just lagging indicators, and so that's part of what I am suggesting. And that's one of the examples of that. The other example, or the other reason for the title of the book being, or the subtitle, I guess, being pushing boundaries in human factors, is because I go beyond just traditional human factors, ergonomics, human machine interaction, and I look at at what some people would even consider more controversial matters. Like, I look at, well, of course, everyone talks about the performance influencing things like nutrition and sleep and stress and those kinds of things. But I go beyond that. I talk about the value of, personal relationship. I talk about sleep. I talk about smiling, and I actually touch on emotional intelligence. One of the most recent books that I also edited, called Operationalizing 21st Century Safety, a Human-Centric Practical Guide. I wrote a chapter there on emotional intelligence, because I think that's an area that we haven't talked about. So if your physical hazards are dealt with by our traditional health and safety approaches, and how we think is dealt with our psychological safety approaches, no one talks about how we feel, right? And how we feel, that's where emotional safety comes to fore. as humans, you and I know, we're very emotional human beings. In fact, there's plenty of research out there to say that most of our decisions are made by emotions and then rationalized by our, intellect and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of interesting data there. So and even down to, I talk about spiritual well-being as another part of that, because, just like, and the reason I talk about that is just like in the 80s and the 90s, we used to tell our personnel, leave your home at home. You are at work now, you need to leave all the stuff that you have, all the problems that you have at home, leave it at home. Well, we don't say that anymore in the 21st century today, in the 2000s and 2000, teens and 20s. Why do we not say that? Well, because we've realized that humans are emotional beings, psychological beings. And so as such, we are this wonderful mess of interwoven data, and what happens at home is very much affecting my ability to think and make effective and efficient and safe decisions at work. And so instead of saying leave home at home today, we actually now pushing psychological safety and how, and we're looking at psychosocial factors and so on and so forth. So by the same factor, I am taking that same principle and that same way of thinking, and I'm saying we're spiritual beings as well, right? And so that is a part of who I am and what I am. And I say that even that plays a role, right, in my ability to work safely. I recently celebrated my 27-year wedding anniversary, and I posted something about it on LinkedIn, and I had to qualify it because generally people post about it on Facebook, not on LinkedIn. LinkedIn being a more of a professional network, but what I said about that kind of goes along with this. See, I think that my marriage and my wife of 27 years, who stands behind me and who is my supporter, I think that that's a huge contribution to my success and my ability to be and to do what I do today. I think that minus that support, I wouldn't be where I am today. And so because of that, I think it's time for us to bring some of those issues and some of those points into the public conversation, because for way too long, we have left them aside and we have tried to have this truncated picture of what an individual is, only to slowly realize one step at a time, oh yeah, we have, tried to build a small caricature of what a person truly is.
So since you do talk quite a bit about off the job factors, let's call it that this whole category of thing that influences work performance, what can safety personnel realistically do about off-the-job factors? Or when you wrote this, was the information really aimed more at frontline workers who may be reading the book?
I think both end. I think that's a very good question, because and you can even go a step further, because I talk about in my book, I even talk about things like chronic illnesses. I mean, you can look at some of the statistics for some industrial nations here in the US, for example. We have had a tremendous uptick in diabetes, for example, right? And as a supervisor, it is really important for me to know if my workforce, if my team, if people on my team suffer from that. Why? Because I need to know what times of day to set them up for work, what times of day to be especially cautious, what tasks, I can truly set them up for success, and what tasks I can truly set them up for failure. And some folks, and I've conducted a lot of trainings on the principles that are described in my book, and I've had a lot of conversation with folks that raise questions. Well, what about here in the US, for example? We have HIPAA laws, right? These are the laws that prevent work supervisors from talking or asking, too intrusive of a health-related question of their teams. And my answer to that is very simple. We need not to break any of those laws. We need not to be too intrusive. All we have to do is just open our ears. I'm going to tell you something. If you ever stand at a lunch break area, if you ever stand by a water cooler, if you ever stand by, your drink station at a workplace, and you just stand there and you just listen, if you care to listen, workers volunteer all kinds of information about themselves. And I'm not saying weaponize that information. I'm saying use that information wisely in order to help them be better selves, right? And so, I think that's what I'm saying there from the perspective. So how can supervisors know and utilize that information? Well, they can know and be better aware of how to set up their schedules, how to set up their teams, how to set up critical tasks as far as personnel, as far as times of day, and those kinds of things. So it's just awareness, right? And also paying a special attention to if Johnny over here on my team is having, has been complaining about having issues at home. Maybe I should ask myself, is his mind in the right place? Is he prepared to do critical electric switching that may put his life and the life of the partner that he's conducting critical electric switching with on the line today? Or maybe I should, ask Johnny. And I've actually seen, it's interesting because I've seen that when these principles are implemented, I have actually seen workers come to their supervisors and say, ever since we started talking about this and raising awareness of this, I've realized that with everything that I've got in my life right now and everything that's going on at home right now, I am not the best person. I'm not the right person for this critical task this afternoon. I'm liable. And so these are the kinds of conversation that I'm going to say. Initially it sounds scary. It sounds like, well, what are you talking about? You're just going to disrupt my operations. Actually, an initial 5-minute disruption in your operations, however light and momentary it may be, is going to save you potentially hours and millions of dollars in recovery, in repair, in restoration, in medication, and so on and so forth. And then that doesn't even say anything about the reputational damages. I've seen studies that reputational and contractual damages are in the tens of millions, from situations like that. So, and the disruption of business. I mean, yesterday we experienced an insane Cloudflare outage that impacted, operations all around the world. What is the cost of the disruption, of business in that? I don't know. I haven't looked at the specifics of that, but a lot of times in my experience, those things go back to some, of course, are technical, but some go back to something as simple as a technician and some data center, some brick and mortar data center somewhere, and it goes right back to human factors, believe it or not.
We've come full circle, folks. I was thinking as you were saying that it would be so refreshing and incredibly wonderful to have a workplace where you can go and say, I'm not up to this, and have the confidence to say right now or this afternoon. It doesn't mean that you're not confident in your ability overall. It just means that the baby didn't get to sleep last night, or you're getting over a cold or something. And that speaks to culture. So I'm going to go into everyone's favorite, safety culture. So in the book, you ask whether safety culture exists, and you contextualize that discussion in terms of other kinds of organizational culture, including just culture. There was I think 5 or 6 different types, but I'm curious about your views on that.
The reason of course, my question is a little bit of a tongue in cheek, I think there. And the reason I say that is because, there have been several debates on the subject of safety culture. And some say there's no such thing. It's just organizational culture. And I get that. And I understand that. You don't have an accounting culture and you don't have, finance culture or operational culture. So I get their point. But at the same time, there's also the point that I make in the book is that language is dynamic. All of our languages are. My first language is Russian. But if I left what at the time was still Soviet Union back in 91 to come to the United States. And so what that means is that my knowledge and my general vocabulary of Russian language kind of stalled out at 1991, right? So if I went back there today, I would be easily recognized as kind of utilizing, somewhat dated vocabulary. And in the same way that, in English language, for example, a word like woke, 20 years ago, no one, if you said that word, someone would think that you just have really poor grammar and you have no idea how to speak in English, because woke is not a real word. Well, today we know that not real word actually has become a real word, and it means a set of whatever they are. So by the same token, I'm not fighting the whole safety culture. I say if that's an easy way to identify what an organization is doing overall with regard to their health and safety, so be it. Let's talk about it. But with the understanding that it's a reflection of the larger larger organizational safety or organizational culture, I guess I should say. Now, with regard to, just culture, I think it goes right back to the previous point. Just culture, I think, is very closely related to psychological safety. It's a place where there is some degree of freedom for personnel to report hazards. If I see something, or maybe even if I did something that might have inadvertently placed myself at some risk or placed the rest of my organization or coworkers at some risk, I feel freedom to report that without knowing that an honest mistake is going to be immediately punished. Now, we've done the blame, shame, and retrain thing for so long that when we initially started looking at the whole idea of just culture, we went, how we react a lot of times. We go all the way to one end of the extreme, and then we end up reacting clear to the other end of the extreme. And so when we went to the no blame, no name, no blame culture, reacting to the name, name, blame, shame, retrain, whatever culture that we had before, well, then we just went and said, complete and total amnesty for all the reports and all the things. Well, that's not right either, because if you have some blatant disregard, you have actions that are being done that not only puts the individual that's doing it, but puts other individuals and maybe other contractors and other bystanders at true risk in a workplace. There needs to be some type of accountability, some type of measures for that. So that's where we found out that the no name, no blame doesn't work either. It's not effective. And so the just culture is kind of in between, right? This is where we recognize and that honest mistakes are just that, and we don't penalize an individual for making mistakes. And therefore that opens the door for us to have the learning culture, right? If we have just culture, we can have learning culture. What does that mean? Well, now we have inputs coming in, information coming in about hazards, about what mitigations work, what controls are effective, what controls are ineffective. So we have learning culture that allows us to have informed culture because information is coming in. Informed culture allows us to know what's working and what's not. We can have flexible culture. So and so on and so forth. So all of these are kind of steps to actually where we can have that right organizational safety culture, whatever you want to call it. And there's no shortcut to it. Anybody that can tell you otherwise is trying to sell snake oil, basically, because there are no 3 easy steps. There are no 15, easy solutions or a 30-day, jump to safety culture. It looks different for every organization based on where they're starting from what their starting point is. It looks different on the basis of what the organization, their leadership commitment is, and a lot of other factors that are involved. The path is different. It's a difficult path. And I also say the other thing I think that's important to add here is that safety culture is not a destination. For those companies that think that they can arrive at safety culture, they're the ones that find themselves one moment bragging about their millions of work hours without a single recordable incident. And the next moment, they go into a fatality, the worst of all incidents. Why? Because they get complacent. They feel like they finally arrived at this safety culture, and they get complacent, and they start try to ride on their coattails of success. Safety culture is not a destination. It's a journey. It's a continuing, constant journey with what I like to refer to the founder of United Parcel Service. He had an interesting philosophy, his own personal philosophical kind of conviction. And it was this continued constructive dissatisfaction, constructive criticism. I mean, he was constantly looking around. And that's what high reliability organizations have kind of picked up, and they've ran with it, right? It's the answer to the question, generally a normal person would answer the question, if it ain't broke, they would answer, don't fix it. But the founder of UPS and high reliability organizations have a different answer for that question. Their answer is, then why isn't it broken yet? So they're constantly this constructive dissatisfaction, constantly looking for how and where and why and when things are going to go down, because we understand that, that we're all fallible, and, none of our systems are perfect. None of our equipment is perfect, and even some of the best design, infrastructures are eventually going to disintegrate. So
I have a ton of questions. I'm not going to get to them all, but I did want to get to this one. You write about soft skills in the book. This podcast focuses very much on soft skills. In your experience, what soft skills do you think people find, or maybe safety professionals find most challenging? And what's your advice for developing those skills?
that's a great question, actually, because this is another one of those areas that I think we need to do a lot more work in. What is our typical organization does? We take a really good person that is very effective on the tools, and he's, my best person, my best producer, right, on my team. And my supervisor says, it's time for you to promote a few people on your team. And I take my best producer and I make him a supervisor. And I've just lost the best producer and gained the worst leader. Why? Minus soft skills. Literally. I mean, because what we a lot of times don't recognize is that the same skills that make him the great producer when he's working with his hands on the tools are not what's going to make him successful as now a leader of people, right? What are the skills that he's going to need? Or she. Well, now this individual is going to need to know how to lead and how to communicate and how to make decisions and how to foster good teamwork, and conflict resolution and all of those things that this individual didn't ever need to know on the tools. He just was happy working with his hands, right? And so, and quite frankly, most organizations, and I have been blessed over the course of my life to work at both smaller mom and pop type operations and all the way to the global tech giants, right? That have these really evolved and really well thought through onboarding journeys, 6 month long of training and so on and so forth. And I'm going to tell you, both ends are still missing any effective ways of promoting, teaching, training, raising, and talking about soft skills. And so I think everything that I've mentioned so far, leadership, what does a good leader look like? What is not a good leader, right? Communication. I mean, the older I get, the more I realize how complicated the subject of communication is. I used to think when I was a young kid, what's so complicated about it? You just say it and that's it. Well, yeah, you can say it, and it can be taken about 15 different ways. And then the way you say it, do you say it to someone face to face? Do you maintain eye contact? Do you say it to someone over email where motives could be ascribed? Do you say it to someone over text? Do you happen to be, is your keyboard stuck in all caps? And that is read by, a younger audience, and now they're thinking you're yelling at them. I mean, there's so many different things that can be read into that. We could talk about nonverbal communication, right? I mean, the fact that most scientists out there and kind of the experts out there are saying 90% of our communication happens nonverbally, right? If you know and master how to read nonverbal, no one will ever be able to kind of slide one past you, right? Because while we can lie verbally, there are certain things that we do that we can't absolutely not control nonverbally. So if you know how to read the cues, you can see the difference between the two. And actually, speaking of nonverbal, it was really interesting to me to watch that play kind of in a global arena. In the months right before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, there were a number of global leaders that went to meet with him in Moscow to try to dissuade him from invading. And it was really interesting to watch every global leader that he didn't like. The pictures coming out of Kremlin was this, I don't know if you saw those pictures, but it was like 10 or 15 foot long conference table. And Vladimir Putin was on one end and the other world leader was on the other. And I'm like, how do you communicate to someone, I don't like you and we're not on the same page, more effectively than putting them on the end of a 15-foot conference table? And then in the midst of all that, he met with a Brazilian leader. I think his name was Bolsonaro or something like that, right in the middle of all that. And the picture that came out of Kremlin was insane. It was Vladimir Putin, a little tiny side table with a little plant on it, and Bolsonaro sitting right next to it. I mean, they were sitting close enough to touch. So what are you communicating there? I see eye to eye with this individual. I like you, and so on and so forth. So it's so interesting to watch if you know what you're watching, to watch this kind of stuff kind of play out in every sphere of influence, in every type of communication or in every conversation. So there's a lot more in soft skills that we can talk about, but I think that that is one of those fields that we need to do a lot more upskilling on, a lot more work.
There's a discussion of religion in your book, specifically your Christianity, and I imagine that that makes the book more inviting for some people and less inviting for other people. As you wrote the book, was that a concern in terms of the impact that the safety information was going to give?
That's a great question, and it's interesting because I'd already broached the subject earlier in the conversation. I am who I am. I make no apologies for who I am. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the reason you and I are talking today, at least in my opinion and in my view, is because of everything that has gone into me becoming who I am. And my personal faith and my faith in Jesus Christ and my relationship with him and my walk with him, that's absolutely a huge part of that overall package that Simon Goncharenko is today. And that's a huge part of what constitutes this conversation. So no, I had zero concerns about that. To this day, I have zero concerns about that. I understand that it may be offensive to some. I for that purpose, I actually included that information in the appendix portion of my book, where I clearly start that. If you look at that book, and I clearly start that by saying, look, if this is not something that's your cup of tea, it's perfectly fine with me. You have read the bulk of what this book is all about. Hopefully you've gained some valuable insights. You're more than welcome to close it down. So I'm not looking to offend anyone. I'm not trying to offend anyone, but I feel like it would be wrong for me to not be true to who I am without covering that area, because that's a huge part of who I am. And so to write a book that's called Save Lives and to not go into and the book that's called Pushing Boundaries and Human Factors, when the entire subject of my book is to push boundaries and to look at things that we haven't looked at before, and to omit a huge part of that, I think I would kind of be breaking the very purpose, the very kind of dictum for which I set out on this journey. So I don't intentionally ever want to offend anybody, but by the same token, I have zero apologies for who I am or for what I am. So
yeah, totally understandable. So if you had to boil down your book, might be the hardest question I'm going to ask you. If you had to boil it down into one recommendation to the safety professionals listening, what would it be?
As you're asking this question, I have a million different thoughts coming into my mind. And whether I actually answer your question or whether I'm turning this into a teachable moment. And I think I'm going to go the second route. I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to tell you why I'm not going to answer that question. Because, for decades and maybe even longer than that, operational leadership has come to safety personnel and asked them for that one thing that they could do, one thing that they could invest in that would satisfy the regulators and at the same time allow them to get over that so they can get on with the business of being productive and being profitable and so on and so forth and making money and doing what it is that they're all about. But I think that's the absolute wrong way of looking at safety. Safety is not about that one thing. It's not about that one trick. And so for me to actually go down that route and be willing to summarize my book into one thing, I think I would be failing all the rest of my safety brothers and sisters out there in basically going down the route of saying that safety could be boiled down to one thing. That's not how it works. I think safety is about incorporating this way of thinking into everything. It's not one thing, it's everything. And so that's, I think, what it's all about. It's changing our way of thinking from what's one thing that we can do to help ourselves to how can we incorporate this way of thinking into everything that we do, whether it's on the job, off the job, and everywhere else in between. Hope that makes sense. I know that didn't answer your question, but there's a teachable moment there.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I would say that everyone has different things to learn anyway and are ready to learn different things at different times. If you could go back in time to the beginning of your safety career, is there any advice you might give yourself?
That's a great question. And I think one of the things that I look back at how I started my safety career that was really helpful, more than anything, I think, and I kind of happened there by accident. But one of the things I did was I was able to take a really deep dive into a lot of the core principles, right? A lot of the key parts of the OSHA regulations, all the way down to taking some specific classes in each regulation and kind of take a deeper dive. And I think as I look at that, having kind of risen through the ranks of safety and having then participated in boardroom conversations with folks that are at the director or VP level of safety, what I have actually witnessed that's really interesting is that I have witnessed where these director and VP level safety professionals have a great knowledge and understanding of the systems way of thinking, and they have a great knowledge of how to lead and how to think organizationally and so on and so forth. But because of where they are today, a lot of them really don't have that deep down technical knowledge all the way down to what does the full protection require in general industry, at which height do you need to start having full protection in construction industry, what is the difference there? And so that's where I think the way that I started, I'm really glad that I just so happened to start the way that I did. And so maybe it wouldn't be an advice to a younger me, but it would be advice to some younger safety professionals that are getting into the field or that are looking to get into the field. I say you will get all the systems and all the organizational and all the other kind of higher level stuff as you progress. That will come with it. But one thing that will not come with it is that you're going to have to take some initiative in is doing this deeper technical dive so that because that's what's going to make you irreplaceable and that's what's going to make you such a valuable commodity and asset on the later on is because you both now have the operational knowledge and the technical knowledge. And there are a few of those individuals out there.
Obviously, the book is the first answer, but other than the book, how can our listeners learn more about the topics in our discussion today? Are there resources that you recommend that you recommend to listeners?
That's a great question as well. So obviously, the book is there, Save Lives, Pushing Boundaries and Human Factors. I already mentioned the other book that we just came out. And there's a cool, interesting story I'm going to tell you a little quick about the second book. When I put the feelers out for the first book, just trying to see initially kind of what the interest was in the market for Save Lives, I started getting all kinds of feedback. And a lot of the feedback that I started getting was from fellow PhDs and safety and from, these operational leaders with just incredible global experience. And they were not only just telling me, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, we do feel like there's need for it. Yeah, there's definitely room for something like this on the market. But they were also going the next step that I didn't expect. And I was kind of shocked. They were saying, and I want to help you, and I want to join you in this project, and I want to write a chapter. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I totally didn't expect that. And so what I did was my desire was to put out my initial product, which was Save Lives, ended up being. And then after some time of kind of doing that on my own, then I came back to these individuals and I said, all right, let's do it. And so we put together a really neat group of people they come from all sorts of walks of life, different countries around the world and so on and so forth, different geographical backgrounds, racial backgrounds. I mean, just a really cool, diverse group of people. And so we put together this second book that I'm an general editor of, Operationalizing 21st Century Safety. So that's another resource that's out there. Save Lives book kind of progressed into as folks started buying Save Lives book on Amazon. I realized that over the first year, the book was purchased on every continent, and it was purchased in, I think, I want to say 15, 16 different countries of every continent. And so there's this, it feels like there's this Save Lives global movement afoot right now, movement to make safety not just the currency of the industrial nations, but the everyday currency of all the other nations as well. And so SaveLivesGlobal.com is a website that kind of that goes along with that talks about it, that offers some additional resources, training resources, speaking resources, and so on and so forth. So that's Save Lives Global. That's that initiatives. And then, of course, LinkedIn is another way where I can be found, where I kind of just share things that I come across. And a lot of times I pose questions, and I kind of continue to do it on Save Lives. On my LinkedIn. What I kind of started in the book is I continue to push those boundaries. Sometimes I say things that maybe are a little bit on the edge, but my purpose, again, just like with the book and with everything else that I do, is not to offend anyone, but to probe those questions, to pose those issues, to identify, those potential challenges, so that we can come together and find greater solutions. Again, it's pushing boundaries of what we talk about.
Yeah, well, and hopefully there will be lots of discussion on LinkedIn when this podcast goes to air. There will be clips on LinkedIn of different things that you've said, and hopefully it garners some discussion.
I look forward to that.
That is our show for today. Thank you for joining me, Simon.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to you, the safety professionals who take the time to listen to our podcast so you can improve your practice to make the workplace safer for everyone. As well, thanks to the Safety Labs team who find, approach, organize, edit, and converse with guests and listeners to make this podcast the success that it is. Bye for now. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Until next time, stay safe.